Donald Trump is awash in the afterglow of his firstness. First president to take his daughter to North Korea on a work trip. First president to say out loud that he has no idea what the term Western liberalism means by dissing the West Coast cities of the United States in response to a reporter's question about it. First president to pass along his penchant for birtherism-style smear campaigns to his son. And yes, first president to meet with a brutal North Korean dictator on that brutal North Korean dictator's home turf and then lavish him with praise.
And it's just an honor to be with you, and it was an honor that you asked me to step over that line, and I was proud to step over the line. You hear the power of that voice. Nobody's heard that voice before. I would invite him right now to the White House.
A voice, and what a face. That look on Donald Trump's face as he's fawning over a dictator could be ripped straight out of the promotional photos for one of his reality shows. But now, the American president using Twitter to set that meetup with Kim Jong-un, leaving the world to wonder, are we less safe today than we were before Trump decided to play nuclear negotiator? The New York Times reports on the substance of U.S.-North Korean negotiations that Trump may become the first American president to greenlight a North Korean nuclear power. Writing this, quote, the concept would amount to a nuclear freeze, one that essentially enshrines the status quo and tacitly accepts the North as a nuclear power, something administration officials have often said they would never stand for. And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Sumi Terry was the director for Korea, Japan, and Oceanic Affairs at the NSC under both Presidents Obama and Bush. With us at the table, former Republican congressman from Florida, now an independent, David Jolly, journalist Elise Labott, who covers foreign affairs. Sam Stein is the politics editor for Daily Beast, and with us from the Washington Post, White House bureau chief Phil Rucker. Phil Rucker, I start with you. Just tell everyone, anyone that was unplugged over the hot summer weekend, give us a little TikTok. Take us through how this meeting came to be.
Well, President Trump was already planning to go to Seoul, South Korea for a meeting with the president there. And he went on Twitter and said, you know, I'm going to be going to the demilitarized zone. Kim Jong-un, if you're listening, if you're watching, come meet me there. We'll say hello and shake hands.
Does he not have a phone? It's Russia. Are you listening? It's, you know, check me out on Twitter.
It's Twitter diplomacy, Nicole. I mean, you have to imagine Trump has thought of this for days, if not weeks, before this. There were all sorts of rumors here in Washington that he was planning to visit the DMZ. In fact, he let that out in an interview earlier in the week with the Hill newspaper, and the White House instructed those reporters not to reveal that plan. Of course, Trump himself leaked it on Twitter.
Of course.
Of course. But he went ahead and did this visit, and sure enough, Kim Jong-un was there with a full delegation of North Korean security officials, with propaganda photographers to capture it all. And of course, it was, you know, pages and pages of propaganda in the North Korean newspapers of Kim Jong-un, the dictator, getting an audience with not just the American president, but his daughter, Ivanka Trump, stepping foot in North Korea. It was a big win, speaking in terms of propaganda, for the North Koreans.
So how are we here, Elise? A big win in terms of propaganda for the North Koreans?
Well, I mean, Kim Jong-un has played President Trump beautifully. I mean, he knows exactly how to get what he wants from the president. The president keeps talking about that loving relationship, and all Kim Jong-un has to do is show up and say nice things. I mean, I'm not someone who doesn't think that these warming relations between the U.S. and North Korea are a bad thing. I think they're a good thing. When you look at where the president was over a year ago talking about fire and fury, you know, he is talking to the North Korean leader. Before that, the only American to do that was Dennis Rodman. So, I mean, in, you know, actuality, that's a good thing. But I think what the president is doing with this, what I've called a diplomatic booty call, which is, you know, mutually, from what I hear, is mutually preserved of both parties, but really doesn't take the relationship very forward. And so it's good that there's the atmospherics and that's stopping tensions, but it's untethered from any policy, any discussion. They did meet and say that they would resume nuclear talks, but we'll see that when it happens. And I just think the lack of a strategy, the lack of a policy, the lack of a process, all we really have are these atmospherics, and that's great. But meanwhile, the North Korean program is still continuing to develop.
David Jolly, there's something I mean, the booty call analogy is a good one. I won't take it too much further, but just the idea that it doesn't mean anything to anyone is an apt parallel.
That's it. Yeah, Kim Jong-un swiped right, as they would say in the app community. But to your point on strategy, I think that's the heartburn globally on this. There are two main issues. First, the presence of Ivanka, and you mentioned this, and we make light of it, but the reality is, while the world's debating whether or not she was qualified enough to be in the room, the scary debate we should be having is whether or not Ivanka Trump was the most qualified person in the room. Consider how Donald Trump approached this meeting on Twitter. Consider that he left his national security advisor on a trip to Mongolia. It was Donald Trump, Ivanka Trump, and Jared negotiating
and Tucker
Carlson negotiating with a dictator. And so the heartburn around the strategy is this. Typically in moments like this, the American people have been led domestically through the politics of what is our national security strategy. It is not unusual to go back and forth between isolationism against an adversary and a warming. We see it in Cuba and Syria, less in Syria, but questions around the red line, we had a national debate. Cuba, do we have an embargo? What do we do in Iran with the nuclear deal? Is it a pathway to a nuclear Iran, or is it limits on a nuclear Iran? With North Korea, Donald Trump has no strategy, and he hasn't brought the American people to this moment where we can embrace what we saw this weekend. Had he done that, regardless of party affiliation, we would be saying, you know what, a reduction in tensions with North Korea is a good thing. Instead, this is seen as this very destabilizing moment when it should be the opposite.
Sumi, that's a great point, and I saw some of your comments in the print coverage and in other interviews, and I want to ask you about that. I mean, has Donald Trump, by sort of prioritizing the optics of this relationship, which for some reason he is just fixated upon. He reportedly takes his letters out and shows them to reporters. He talks about it at MAGA rallies. He talks about how they love each other. When they see each other, he flatters his voice. He talks about how no one has heard this voice. The Trump family talks about the Korean Peninsula like the next Boca. Like, imagine it, developed with condo. I mean, it's really weird, and you can get caught up in the glibness of the way they talk. But what are the serious dangers on a policy level?
Well, I'm glad the bromance between President Trump and Kim Jong-un is alive and well. But you have to remember, since the Hanoi summit, Singapore summit, it's been a year, and we don't have even agreed upon definition or understanding on the definition of denuclearization. We don't have anything. We don't have roadmap. We don't have timeline. We don't have declaration of their nuclear missile program. Meanwhile, they've been working on their nuclear missile program in the past year. And so where we're going to go from here is, I'm afraid that we're setting ourselves up for some sort of an interim deal, which might sound good in theory, where I can see Kim Jong-un offering something up on the negotiating table, such as Yongbyon and even plus Yongbyon, something besides Yongbyon for sanctions relief. But it really is, like that New York Times article said, it's like a freeze deal and capping of the program, but we don't even know if they're really capping it. So what that means is, I think North Korea is on its way of achieving its goal, which is to gain international acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear weapons power. And we are not anywhere near achieving our goal, which is denuclearization.
Sumi, explain what you're talking. You're talking about one facility, but it is the belief of the intelligence community, which I believe Donald Trump said should go back to school the last time the intelligence community testified about North Korea's nuclear progress and ambitions in the year since that Singapore summit. But just explain a little bit further to our viewers what you're talking about with that one facility and the weaknesses from a strategic and policy level to focusing just on that.
So what Kim Jong-un has basically more or less offered in Hanoi is one nuclear facility, a main nuclear facility that produces fissile material. But North Korea has many facilities. They have overt facilities and covert facilities. So for North Korea to offer up one aging facility on the negotiating table and for us to take that, this is not a good deal, particularly if we are going to give ease sanctions. And easing of sanctions is what Kim Jong-un wants. And Kim may calculate that this is a perfectly fine deal for him to offer up Yongbyon one facility or even add one more facility, because he gets to still keep all of his nuclear weapons and missiles. North Korea has up to 60 nuclear warheads. So what about the nuclear program? What about the missiles? What about the intercontinental ballistic missiles? So just offering up a facility that they may not really need And for us to take that as a deal, that's not a good deal for the United States.
So Sumi and Elise know more about North Korea than I do, but here's the impression I've been left with since Trump has been president. Otto Warmbier, as a North Korean prisoner, was beaten so badly that we decided not to play his parents' description of the condition in which their son came home because it's too upsetting, and people have heard it before. Donald Trump sought to put Otto Warmbier's parents in the viewing gallery during the State of the Union. He saw to it to benefit politically from bringing their son's body home. They've become critics of Donald Trump's North Korea policy for the very reason that everyone is talking about, that he now deigns to legitimize and to greenlight North Korea as a nuclear power. My other sort of window into this regime was explaining some of this to Sarah Palin and showing her the satellite image of darkness over North Korea. This is who Donald. Well, this is who. Look at. I mean, to her credit, you know, she was someone who understood the lack of morality and the brutality of someone like Kim, and to see him constantly disparage our allies and to talk about an adversary the way Presidents Reagan and Obama and Clinton used to talk about our closest allies is jarring.
Well, I think we're all old enough to remember that when President or candidate Obama talked about meeting unconditionally with dictators to talk about these types of programs, there was an incredible amount of outrage, not just among conservatives, but among some Democrats as well. Mm-hmm. It was naivete. It was strategically improper. It was a rookie mistake, so to speak. And, of course, Trump's done exactly what Obama had said he would do, but never actually did in practice. If you think about the Iran nuclear deal, there was a deal prior to the deal to get into the conversations for the deal. Yeah. So all these meetings that President Trump is having with Kim, they may be fine diplomatically. I share your belief that there's nothing wrong inherently with talking with someone, but they are a missed opportunity cost. You are missing the chance to actually get a concession out of the North Korean side in exchange for walking into the demilitarized zone.
Sam's exactly right. I mean, look, the fact that he's the first president to step into the North Korean side of the DMZ, you know, good for him. And he's taking this risk, but you should be getting something for that. He's talking about inviting Kim Jong-un to the White House. You need to get a big concession for that. I do want to say one thing about this reporting about a possible, willingness to accept a freeze. That's been on the table for years, and I don't think that the president or any of his advisors are going to accept that as the deal.
Why wouldn't Trump do something that's been on the table for years?
But what I'm saying is that we're talking about an interim step. I don't know that it's an interim deal, but, President Obama, President Bush, we're also talking about a freeze situation where then you have a freeze during negotiations. They were talking about that during Iran. So, I mean, who knows? You're right. Maybe he does.
I guess the difference is the Hanoi summit blew up because they couldn't even settle on a shared reality. That summit couldn't continue because they couldn't even. So how do you carry on an interim step?
I think look, you have to start somewhere. The U.S. wants what they've been calling for years is irreversible, verifiable. I'm going to get the order mixed up, but complete, irreversible, verifiable disarmament. Kim Jong-un wants to give nothing. And so you have to meet somewhere in the middle, or those negotiations
The other thing that is worth mentioning here is that, and this goes to your point, the personnel surrounding the president is playing a significant role. I remember during the Iran talks, you had Ernest Moniz, who understood the nuclear physics issue better than anyone on the planet.
Literally, understood nuclear, he was the nuclear science.
So he could get into the extreme specifics about what type of materials the Iranians could still have. You had seasoned diplomats who understood Iranian political culture. Right now you have Jared and Ivanka.
I mean, that's probably oversimplifying a little bit. No, it's not. John Bolton was in Mongolia. Whatever you think of him, he wasn't there.
Still there.
But the North Koreans,
it's clearly not the same.
The North Koreans are not giving a declaration, as Sumi said, of all of their facilities. So you don't really know if they're freezing. You don't really know what else they have. So, it would be a good interim step if North Korea was playing in good faith, but there's, absolutely no way to prove that they are.
Sumi, I hear you. Let me get Phil Rucker back in, though, on Donald Trump, because I think we can't have this conversation as though we're discussing a normal White House. Donald Trump has no idea that conditions are supposed to be met before you step into North Korea. Donald Trump has no idea. Donald Trump doesn't even accept his own intelligence. So what does this process look like, Phil Rucker?
You know what? It's a policy that's shaped almost entirely by his view of relationships, personal relationships with these leaders. The reason he wants the partnership with Kim Jong-un is because he's in search of a deal. He's in search of history. He's in search of a Nobel Peace Prize. Remember his
history. He doesn't know what Western liberalism
but
means.
Nicole, remember him talking to Kim Jong-un when they first had that summit is what inspired Trump to go around calling Prime Minister Abe and others, saying he should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by taking that step. He sees history in his grasp, and he doesn't quite know how to get the deal. He just knows that if he has a relationship with Kim Jong-un and that they're friends and they get along and they love each other, that they can somehow ink something in paper that will be the deal.
But speaking of history, he doesn't get his history right. Here he is lying about President Obama. Oh, here it is. Let me read it to you. This was his comment about why President Obama did not take the bold first step that he took. President Obama wanted to meet, and Chairman Kim would not meet him. The Obama administration was begging for a meeting. They were begging for meetings constantly, and Chairman Kim would not meet with him. Sumi, were you the one doing the begging on behalf of President Obama? Were you begging?
This is so untrue. It's the furthest thing from the truth. President Obama, when he was a candidate, said he was willing to meet with Kim Jong-il if needed be. But no, he was not begging. It was North Koreans. It's the North Koreans who have consistently asked to meet with the U.S. president. And there's a reason why no U.S. president has met with North Korean leader, because it boosts their legitimacy, it gives them credibility. So no, that's absolutely not true. And can I just say, in the just earlier discussion, the problem with the interim deal is that North Koreans are right now looking for huge sanctions relief. So it's fine if they're going to sort of give up something for a little something. But what they were asking for in Hanoi was lifting of 5 United Nations Security Council resolution sanctions. So most of the sanctions to be lifted for 1 or possibly 2 facilities. And that doesn't do anything with their nuclear and missile program. They get to keep all their programs. So
So it's a bad deal, is what you're saying.
But it's because they're looking for huge sanctions relief. That's the problem. The cost is too high.
So, David Jolly, I think those of us who cover Trump day in and day out understand that bad deals are his brand. And the idea that he would sacrifice U.S. foreign policy, this is the obvious sort of tail to the head and body we've been following for 3 years.
That's it. The unsettling part of this for many people was the pride with which Donald Trump stepped onto North Korean soil, the baked-in dishonesty in the narrative, the level of palpable ignorance that he demonstrated in doing so, and it reflected somebody who is putting his own brand above the national security interests, not just of the United States, but of the region in which Donald Trump was visiting. The level of ignorance in that moment is conveyed to somebody who doesn't even have a working knowledge of foreign policy, because for generations we've just trusted that our president does. And what we saw in Donald Trump this weekend was a president who has no understanding of the complexities of geopolitical strategy or national security.
And it would seem that on top of that, he has no personal moral compass, because I've worked for politicians, and a lot of people arrive in Congress and they're not well briefed on the issue. The American public can tolerate a steep learning curve. But I think what we've never had before is a learning curve and someone devoid of character and sort of morals. And if you look at the constant apologizing for Khashoggi, the arbitrary nature of wanting a different standard for North Korea's nuclear program than Iran's, it's simply because Obama negotiated the Iran deal. I mean, just pair those two pieces together. What do we have?
As we've said, for Donald Trump, it's about the ratings. And I go back to my earlier point. We have allowed, as the American people, presidents to approach these issues with a certain level of uncertainty. The Iran deal being a perfect example. Some would say, look, it put off a nuclear-armed Iran for decades.
Wasn't perfect.
Others would say it created a nuclear pathway for Iran. And that's where the debate diverged and people got the debate. But there was no question that at least President Obama was making his case. There is no case that Donald Trump is making here other than I was the first. I was the first, and I'm talking to Kim Jong-un, and no other president has. And it just reflects an ignorance that should concern us. We shouldn't be celebrating it, as so many, particularly on other networks, are this week.
Well, and also, he just super quick, he's priding these relationships on getting a deal that he's the deal maker. Where are the deals? deals.
There aren't any deals.
There aren't any-
Simi, I want to give you the last word, and I want to ask you, I want to put you on the spot. Do you have any friends or former colleagues back in the NSC or back in the State Department who are uncomfortable with this direction in policy and wondering whether they can sort of continue to do their work?
I am positive there are many that's very uncomfortable with a direction that this is headed. Because as I mentioned before, I think we are on the path of North Korea achieving its goal. Interim deal or drag this out, wait it out, they will get there. I mean, we're not anywhere near achieving our goal. We don't have anything. It's been a year since Singapore. We just have 3 meetings and big made-for-TV moments, and that's about it.
And do people that do the kind of work you devoted your work to doing, would they resign or quit before they were a party to what you just described?
Well, I think this individually they're making different decisions, but I will tell you that I think the intelligence community, also my former colleagues from the agencies, the morale it has to be low because the president just consistently throws the intelligence community under the bus. And you know, the president is your ultimate. That's why you're doing this, right? You're you're trying to tell truth to power, your analysis to the policymakers, and if they're throwing your analysis out the door, that's very demoralizing.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.